all those priors, all those assumptions that we've made that go into our experience, that is, I'm a model, I'm in here, I'm looking out. And that's what we think of as that's consciousness. All this other stuff going on in the brain is not conscious. Well, I'm disputing that completely, saying there's something it's like to be all of these, but we're deluded because.
How's things going, Sue? How are you?
Oh, I'm fine. I mentioned in the email that I'm down in my hut. I have this writing hut down in Salcombe, which is a little town by the sea. I can look out there and look at the water, and the howling gale and the wind and the rain at the moment again. And I've just done a 10-day online retreat here, which finished on Sunday night. So I'm still a bit sort of be mindful, but
to all of those who are watching this or listening, the last time we spoke, you also just finished a retreat, which is pretty cool.
That's weird, isn't
at the
it?
right time, yeah. Good.
I normally only do one a year, occasionally too, but that is a slightly odd coincidence. Yes. Anyway, how are you?
I'm good. I'm great. A lot has changed since we last spoke. You sent me an email a few months ago saying we've got it all wrong about consciousness, and it's a new revelation, I would say. You've experienced some sort of a new thought within the consciousness community, so I'm super eager to discuss and dissect this.
Well, it's not that super brilliant at all. It's actually only a part of what we talked about last time.
Okay.
But I thought, well, is it different? And it's very hard for me to remember exact. Do you find this? I remember you last time telling me, about your progression of your thoughts. And do you find it hard to remember what you thought 2 years ago or 4 years ago?
It is. It's every time I read it back, I feel like another person, continuously evolving. And I think the more people you're exposed to and the different theories, especially with this channel, because it's all I explore all the time, it's becoming a blur.
Yeah. Well, let me try and answer the question that you asked, given that I can't remember what I said last time or even what I thought a few years ago. If I said something that sounded a bit dramatic, it was only this. The most fundamental, going back a bit, we talked about illusionism and my delusionism, that we're just deluded from the very beginning in the way we think about our own minds. And when I thought about it, I thought, the most fundamental assumption that people make, and it underlies the neural correlates of consciousness and all sorts of other problems, is that it is the physical object that is the subject of consciousness. So what is it like to be a bat? Well, the assumption is that it's the bat, this physical object called a bat, that has this thing called consciousness. So already by asking the question that way, you are putting yourself on the verges of dualism. And it's inevitable that you're going to have the hard problem. It's not sort of an accidental thing you may or may not have. It's intrinsic in that question. Now, we're talking about, what we used to think. I'd never really queried that it was a good question. What is it like to be a bat? I thought there were problems with it and difficulties, but fundamentally, that's what we're asking, is what is it like? So I've changed from thinking that the right question is what is it like to be a bat to what is it like to be the bat's model of a bat? It's the models, the mental models that we build that are the subjects of consciousness. Now, it's not an earth-shattering thing, but in a way, it's shattering to me in a way because it changes what we're asking, and it brings up all these questions which you've gone on and on in your own mind about the nature of the so-called physical world.
Yes, it's very similar to Michael Graziano's approach, if you think about it, because that's exactly what he talks about. Is that instead of asking what is consciousness, ask what is the model that is making us ask what is consciousness, and try and figure out the answer to that question. Is that approximately where you're headed with this?
No, but you're absolutely right to ask that, because I really like Graziano's attention schema theory, when I came across it, I thought, of course, yeah, we have a body schema. Now, you know all my work on out-of-body experiences, the solution, but the kind of piece that fell into place in 2001 with Blanke's experiment study was realizing that it's a disruption of the body schema in the right temporoparietal junction that causes my body schema's out there now. It causes the possibility of an out-of-body experience. So I'm very familiar with that idea. And then realizing, of course, we not only have to model our body and what our body is doing all the time, but we have to model our attentional processes. So we're not only paying attention to this, that, and the other, but we're having an overall, a higher level model of our attentional processes. Well, now I think I'm going to some attention is just pulled automatically. Some is, now I'm going to pay attention to this. I want to be more mindful of this, pay more attention to this, and all this is modeling. So I was very excited to, when he first published that, and thinking, this is great. And then I got thinking, as I often do, about Dennett, my dear beloved, no longer with us, Dennett, and indeed Keith Frankish, who I was talking to yesterday. But hang on a minute. Why is there something it's like to be the attention schema? And he doesn't say. He doesn't even ask. Well, maybe I need to read his work more closely, but I don't think he even asks that question. He slithers from this brilliant idea that somehow the attention schema is important for consciousness to, well, that's a theory of consciousness. Well, it's not. It doesn't answer the question. Now, well, what do you think?
That's a tough one. I think the last time I spoke to Mike, I sort of get where you're saying that this, merely saying that there is a model that's discussing consciousness, or is asking the question of what is it like to have consciousness, still doesn't explain the hard problem of consciousness. It's almost like there's still this gap that we need to solve. So I sort of get what you're talking about. It's not like he's bridging the explanatory gap by saying that. But how would you say your version of this model is different from that?
Okay. Yes. I agree with you. And we don't need to solve the hard problem. We need to change it. I mean, so many people have said the hard problem, which is why I'm saying if you think there's something it's like to be a bat or a robot or anything, you've inevitably got it. So how do I would like to say I avoid it or get around it or no. Well, anyway, whatever. I don't solve it because I don't think it's a soluble problem. But here is the suggestion, right, that all active mental models, there's something it's like to be them, all of them. What is it like to be any active mental model? It's like whatever the model says it's like, because that's what a model is. So in this brain here, this massive hierarchical predictive processing kind of brain, there are models at every level in a huge hierarchy, and some of them are incredibly simple. So in visual cortex, there'll be models that are basically saying yes or no, it is or isn't a line, and then there'll be slightly more complicated ones saying this is a square, and then slightly more complicated ones, and then going on, if the temporal lobe, you'll have models of it's a house, it's firing in the house area, and that's changing it from all the other things that it could be, making the comparison all the way up. And you've got higher up. I'm not saying there's a top. There probably isn't. It's probably more of a tangled hierarchy. But I mean, this is something that's an empirical question, really. Is a model of self? Is a model I'm in here, I'm looking out. And that's what we think of as that's consciousness. All this other stuff going on in the brain is not conscious. Well, I'm disputing that completely, saying there's something it's like to be all of these, but we're deluded because the only ones that we have, because we are a model as well, the only ones that we're conscious of is the ones that are in part of this model.
So philosophically, this almost changes your view, because does this lead? I was speaking to Peter Hughes. Am I pronouncing that correctly? And he
Hughes, yes.
He doesn't live too far away from you. So he was telling me.
Yeah. He lives in Exeter. Yeah.
He says, by the way, he's meaning to come and visit soon. So just a message.
I keep asking him. We live in a fantastic converted barn by a little river with our own bridge over the river. And it's been a fantastic place for the last 16 years. And I keep inviting him to come because we're moving house soon and we have to leave this wonderful place. And I think, Peter, come on. You said you'd come and we'll sit and hang out and talk about consciousness. And we could even swim in the freezing cold river. And, I'm not sure he'd want to do that. But yeah, if you talk to him again, tell him to do it.
He said the same thing. He said, you're moving soon, and he actually is meant to come and see you. And I think that's part of his plan. So hopefully it happens soon. Maybe he'll watch this. I'll tell him to watch it, but he needs to visit soon. But I told him that it might be transitioning into a panpsychism, your view. So,
yes.
So let's discuss that. What are the philosophical implications of your new, let's say, revelation?
I was wondering whether we're transiting to the Bible or whether you're thinking that I've had a great revelation in the middle of the night and it's all come clear.
Word choice there, my bad. Your recent change of view.
I think it's great to call it a revelation because I suppose it's as close to a revelation as I'm likely to have. Right. What is its connection with panpsychism you were mentioning in particular? Well, it is a kind of panpsychism, but it's a very weird. There may be philosophers out there who've done this before, and it's all old hat. I don't know, but I've certainly not come across it. By saying that every active mental model in a predictive processing system, there's something it's like to be. That is a panpsychism of models.
Mm.
I wish there was a better name than model because models sound so kind of passive. That's why I say active. I mean, while it's happening, the brain processes are making a guess about what's out there in the world. And that guess is, well, at the moment, my visual system is guessing if I look at that fence, it's going to carry on round the corner and that sort of thing. That is what I mean by these models. But I'd like to have a better word for it. Construction, idea, no word fits perfectly. But whatever it is, a panpsychism of models, yes, that's in that sense, it's panpsychism. It's nothing like the panpsychism of what's sometimes called bottom-up panpsychism, that, not only are this you, me, bats, that chocolate biscuit that I haven't eaten yet, and the cup of tea and the table, but the atoms and molecules and right down to the lowest level of what there might muons and whatever, there's something it's like to be them. This is nothing like that.
Mm. And I'm assuming it also doesn't go all the way up into cosmopsychism as well.
No, it doesn't. Unless, it could, in perhaps not the way you mean, but let's suppose that AI keeps going in the way that it looks as if it's going, in the way that I've talked about as streams, as a third replicator, where machinery that we produced, we thought for our own benefit, is actually now doing the copying, varying, and selecting on its own, and all this stuff is happening. And maybe it would connect up with other planets. If you've got it kills all us off, but somehow it doesn't kill us off before it's managed to get its own system together to dig up the oil and keep going and can survive the terrible climate that we're leaving for it. And a great doomsday scenario. There is a revelation. Yeah. This is good for the end of the new Bible. Sorry, I must stop laughing. So you could imagine that kind of thing, multi-planet, if you like, with non-biological machinery, but if it worked in a kind of predictive processing way, modeling the world around it, modeling the cosmos, whatever that really means, and connected up in a huge way, that would be a sort of cosmo-panpsychism. This idea doesn't rule out the possibility of the same thing occurring in artificial systems or in enormously huge interconnected systems.
Yes, I must say it's not that uncommon for illusionist thinkers to slowly tread along a panpsychist view eventually. It seems to be something that I've found quite common, and it's not that much of a leap, although it sounds like it is, to go from nothing is conscious to everything is conscious. There's a very fine line where that tilt occurs, and it's happened to many people, I think.
That's very interesting, because I think there are other contexts in which if you get to one end to nothing, actually you kind of flip back to the other end of everything. But tell me more what you think. Some examples of this where this has happened, because I'm very interested in my, as it were, slide into a version of panpsychism. How did this happen? You know?
So I think one example would be when I spoke to Carl Friston about this, and I mentioned, if you think of active inference, if you talk about the brain's prior information, posterior conclusions, the free energy principle, is it not possible to then conclude that there is no consciousness and go down the philosophical route of illusionism with your theory? And he agreed. He said, yes, it's very easy to take that route. But on the flip side, it's also very easy to use that same very neuroscientific physicalist theory and head down a panpsychist route. And then that's why his work with Mike Levin occurs, and all the other work that's being done in this field occurs with this diverse intelligence mindset. So it doesn't seem to be too difficult. And I see whereabout it kind of happens with some thinkers. And then I also think about when Philip Goff used to say, he thinks panpsychism is the number one theory, and he thinks that if he had to choose on a second theory, it would be illusionism. And then that also sort of makes sense because it's not that difficult. It's still very much physicalist. It still has a lot of the same elements. It's not like a big leap, although it seems like it is.
I think what's going on there, that's great that you've described that and noted that that Philip and others have gone that way. To me, the problem with where that's gone is you are still saying that the subject of the experience is what we call a physical object. And I'm jettisoning that, because that's the only way I can make this work. So why does the world seem to have physical objects in it? So if you take the leap I've taken from a panpsychism of models, I'm still saying there's modeling machinery that is doing the modeling, that is saying that's a fence out there and that's a tree and that goes, whatever it is. And this is a problem. What is the status of the actual world? If there is such a thing, what on earth is it? Now, if you went to Bernardo Kastrup, his analytic idealism, or Deepak Chopra, with whom I've had such interesting disputes, his form of Advaita Vedanta and that form of idealism, then you do away with any external world. But then I just don't get, and I've argued this with both of them. Why does science work? Why should the world turn out to have things that appear to be like brains, that we can do the maths and we can do the experiments? Why is that the case? You've got to have an explanation of that, which materialism kind of gives you reasons why things happen, and you can make sensible theories. So what do you do with a pure idealism? I think you've still got a problem. So I am really struggling and wondering about theories, or sort of proto-theories, ideas that people are having, physicists mostly, about some underlying nature of something that gives rise to the appearance of this particular kind of physical world, in which brains, we model brains, we do experiments. And, when I think about my brain in here, I've never seen it. And even if I did see it, it's still a model of a brain. But the theory works on how the brain's doing it. So this is the way it goes. And there are physicists saying, because of the fundamental problems that quantum mechanics is incompatible with space-time and all this kinds of things, there's all wonderful struggles going on. But there are physicists who say that space and time are not fundamental. Now, we're getting back to retreats here, because it's not that unusual in deep meditation to have the revelation. Do you like that word? It's kind of realization in certain states that, time is just a construct. It literally seems to have disappeared. There is change. There's something happening, as it were, but not in time. Space as well kind of dissolves, and yet there's still something. So that side of my life encourages me to try and think this way. So is there some, like Don Hoffman, for example, talks about some underlying mathematical structure? And no way can I understand the maths, obviously. But I am fascinated by the idea that underlying this all, there is some kind of mathematical structure which gives rise to the sort of structures that we have. Unlike the idealism, which seems to me, Bernardo just says, oh, well, it's like ripples on the water and it's a dissociative something or other. That doesn't seem to help. Maybe this helps, maybe it doesn't. But that's kind of the way I'm going. So that then ultimately could explain how we come to be able to explain the way that brains can build models. We live these models, which are descriptions of what appears to be an external world that we live in.
At what point, evolutionary, do you think these modeling processes within the panpsychist view? First of all, I think I should mention, I never thought I would reach a point in my life where I would see Susan Blackmore telling me she's a panpsychist.
Yeah. Well, if I live long enough, I expect there'll be some more surprises. You were probably one of those people who kept thinking I was a materialist, however much I told people I wasn't, because you can see why. Because I'm saying, this is the way to understand out-of-body experiences. We've got to understand what's going on in the brain. And look, it's not a spirit leaving the body. It's actually a disruption of the body schema. And people go, there you are, you see, you're just dismissing them and you're a materialist and you're a reductionist and you say it's not true. I'm going, of course it's true. You have the experiences, but they're not like that. But they still think I'm a materialist. So good. Well, I'm glad you've seen me change a bit.
I think it's good.
No, because I've stayed the same in that respect. But I mean, you followed along with this. Thank you.
No, it's been a fascinating journey. I'm waiting for the day you write a book about God and its existence, and that day is probably not going to come though.
I think I'm not going to write about God and its existence. No, probably not.
I can tell that's never going to happen. But anyway, I think so. There's a few things you touched on. You mentioned one thing that I think we should really touch on is, since we last spoke, we lost one of the greatest pioneers in philosophy, and that is Daniel Dennett. He's a hero to me, is a hero to you. What are your thoughts on the impact he's left on this field and in society in general?
Very, very difficult. I'll just add that for me, it was particularly poignant the day he died. 19th of April was Charles Darwin's day that he died. And it was also, much more trivial, the day that Emily and my book, the 4th edition of Consciousness and Introduction, was launched. And we were on our way to Tucson, to the Tucson conference last year in April. And we were, got the first copies of the book, and we were driving in a hire car from LA airport to Tucson. And we got the news from a friend on our phones that he died that day. And but more importantly, to think about your question, I have very complicated and mixed feelings about it. He was a great friend, a huge supporter in many ways. He really helped me in the beginning with the Me Machine. I never would have written the Me Machine if he hadn't encouraged me right from the start, which was great. I don't think he liked my thoughts on consciousness too much, but never mind. I think the greatest gift that he gave to the field, and most people were not listening and they couldn't understand it, was to point out all the pitfalls, to point out again and again and again where we go wrong. I mean, I have not reread Consciousness Explained in a long time, but I remember I read it first, absolutely, when it first came out, and went to a lecture of his, and that inspired me to do the first ever experiment on change blindness, because I was so amazed in this lecture and in the book. I reread it on a holiday some years later. We went on a nice sunny holiday in Greece with a pool, and I did nothing on that holiday apart from meals and walks and things, but read that book. And it took me the entire week's holiday to reread that book. And again, I was stunned by it, because the things that I had forgotten and things that I hadn't properly understood. I'm saying this because I understand why people didn't understand. Now, that was his greatest gift. Multiple drafts theory is really hard to get, and I have mixed feelings about that, which is very interesting. What I think, I mean, there's no question that he made a massive contribution to the field of consciousness. He was part of the process of launching the fact that there is a field of consciousness studies at all. That, and then 3 years after that, Chalmers comes along and coins the term the hard problem. And, it was really all starting there. And Dan went on all the time, pushing this, doubt this, what about this, think this through, all the time. But the disservice I think he did was to the discussions about free will, because he would not say that free will is an illusion. And the reasons why he wouldn't say it, I've never really understood. I've argued with him so much about that. And one of the things I really regret from a purely selfish point of view is, why couldn't I have done a podcast discussion with Dan ever before he died? Because these kind of things were only just beginning to happen, and I didn't. There are a couple of things online of me talking with him, but not much. But in various places, he says, well, first of all, there's no audience in the Cartesian theatre. And it's that audience that would have free will, isn't it? I mean, and if there isn't anyone there, and if that's an illusion, if that's a benign user illusion, I don't think it's benign, but anyway, if it's a benign user illusion and it thinks it's got free will, then free will is part of the benign user illusion, isn't it, Dan? And he actually says in various places that free will is just not what you think it is. Well, what's the definition of, I'm getting cross now, like, Dan, what is the official dictionary definition of an illusion? Is something that it's not what it seems to be. So if he's actually saying that free will is not what it seems to be, Dan, it's an illusion. So that, I think, was a disservice, because his whole thrust of his philosophical life on consciousness was to show people where they're going wrong, where the natural, biologically based, natural ideas we have, which are dualist and, self-centered and so on, are wrong, getting people out of that. And then he allows them to go on believing that there's this magical process. And he even says, oh, it's not magic, but he kind of encourages them to go on thinking that it's, to being a compatibilist, that it's compatible with, with science, basically. And it isn't. In my opinion, it isn't. In my opinion, he was wrong. So that leaves me sad about Dan. He told me, in as many words, I hope before I die, I will persuade you that you're wrong about free will. And I hoped that I knew I wouldn't, but I kind of had the reciprocal hope that I could possibly persuade him to start saying it's an illusion, but we both failed. Then he died.
No, I completely agree. When you mentioned you wish you had a podcast with him, he was one of those people I had on the top of the list. When I started this podcast, I really wanted to chat to him, and we sent a couple of emails back and forth, and he said one day it will happen, and then we obviously never got that chance. So it also really disappoints me that I never got to pick his brain and discuss it. And I mentioned, in my dissertation, you guys, both of you, and Keith and a lot of people were quoted many times. I think Dan was one of the most quoted at the time when I was writing that.
Probably, yeah.
So I really wish I got a chance to speak to him. But I agree. I think that when he spoke about free will, it felt more of a social theory for him. It felt more too close to heart, where it was difficult for him to become the philosopher he really is with that topic for some reason. Is that what you felt? Do you feel like he held it to a social subject rather than a philosophical conversation?
Yes, you put that really well. I think that's right. Why then? Why did he find that so hard?
I've always thought that when I read it, I felt like it's very strange that he's not applying his intuition pumps to this concept, because that was what he was known for. But yeah, he's a true hero.
This reminds me of, because I told you that I've just been on this retreat. It was a 10-day jhanas retreat that's a training in getting into these different altered states of consciousness that you can get into through concentration. It's very, very interesting. There were lots of discussions in the discussion time about the Buddha very clearly says in many ways in different places in the suttas, the early suttas, that there is no reincarnation. There isn't anybody to be reincarnated. There isn't any life after death. All the stuff about, will you be reborn in a better life and so on, is clearly not true, in very clearly stated in many of the things that he says. And there's a lot of evidence that not only do people like to believe that, obviously, but the cultures into which Buddhism went very often had these beliefs in reincarnation and so on. So it's not surprising that it all gets mixed up. And lots of people think that Buddhists have to believe in reincarnation, which they don't have to. Well, at least I know some who aren't. I'm not a Buddhist myself, and I certainly don't. But there are also actual Buddhists who don't. And in this in discussions in the retreat, I asked, and somebody else was asking, the sort of question: well, why is it that in some of the sutras and some of the later sutras, he is talking to a whole mass of people, and people ask him, well, is this person going to be in their next life in a better reincarnation? And he answered those questions. Well, why did he answer those questions if he clearly doesn't believe it's true? And then the answers, or possible answers, that were discussed were, well, he was just using skillful means because those people he was talking to were so deeply embedded in that culture. If he'd just said, oh, that's rubbish, they'd have wandered off and wouldn't have stayed there. Whereas in more sophisticated, when he's talking one-to-one or small groups of his followers who could accept it, he was actually saying the truth as he saw it, that there's just this and there isn't a continuation of somebody who's experiencing this. So I don't know if that's a very good analogy, but from what you've described of what you think about Dan, it's kind of the same thing more than 2,000 years later. So perhaps we ought to be more forgiving. I ought to be more forgiving of Dan.
Look, I think a lot of people will have some sort of a situation where this occurs. It's almost like a politician trying to discuss certain conversations with the masses and then going back to their cabinet and discussing the same topic. It's kind of like you put on a certain show with certain people and then you go back to your actual views when you discuss it with colleagues or friends. Maybe, but I think it's yours is a better analogy to that. But anyway, let's go back to Keith.
That raises the whole question of truth and what is truth. And, probably a lot of us think, I always want to tell the truth and all I want is to find the truth. And then you sort of start finding out that you're not entirely sure what you mean by the truth. And
yeah, and most people don't even realize how much they lie to themselves. So that's the first thing they need to first figure out is, am I telling myself the truth? Yeah.
Yes.
When you spoke about the fact
entire life doing that.
When you spoke to Keith yesterday, what's his thoughts on these views, on this change of yours?
Oh, well, I don't yet know. He wrote me the most wonderful email. We arranged to do a podcast discussion, and he wrote me a most wonderful email. He actually has read or reread almost all of my books in preparation for this. And I'm like, what? How can somebody, that was just sort of amazing. And he was saying, how excited he got about some of my ideas about the prescience, as he sees it, of the me machine, which is now 25 years old. That encourages me to do a second edition or do something because, well, anyway, never mind. And other things that he was commenting on. And he laid out sort of 3 sections of what we'd like to talk about. One was out-of-body experiences and all that stuff. Another one was memes. And another one was consciousness. Well, we did more than an hour. And I get very tired, and an hour is as much. And him as well. He has a problem with fatigue as well. So after an hour and a quarter, we stopped, and we'd only done the first section. So I have not discussed, and we've agreed we're going to do 2 more okay. and do the others. Meanwhile, I sent him I've written sort of 3/4 of a paper that I want to submit for publication about these ideas, which is the first thing that I've written down about them. I've talked in a couple of small contexts to audiences, but and to Peter Shostad Hughes and his little group in Exeter. They were really helpful, with criticisms, but they seem to kind of take it worth thinking about. Anyway, so I began writing this paper, and then it wasn't finished when I was going on the retreat, but he wanted to read it. So I sent it to him, And when I got back, and I haven't been able to look at his comments, he's written comments all, I mean, you look the side box, in Word, and it's like, but he said he's really excited by the ideas. And so I can't answer. Knowing Keith a bit, I think he'll have some very useful criticisms. And clearly he's not dismissing. That's the nice thing to me. He's not dismissing it and saying this is rubbish. He is interested enough, thinks it's worth having a go at. But I can't answer yet, but I will be able to answer when we get around to this conversation. I
agree with you. Keith is so wonderful that this was about 2021, when I had emailed him, I think maybe 2019, I can't remember. But when I was doing my dissertation, I'd sent him an email saying, hey, would you mind having a look at this and just letting me know what you think? And exactly the same thing happened. He replied a week or so later with a whole bunch of comments along the side. And at the end, I actually wrote, with special thanks to Nicholas Humphrey, Keith Frankish, Michael Graziano, because these people actually assisted me to write this at the time. And it was really, really thoughtful because he gave me probably the most notes. And you were talking about stamina and just staying for a long podcast. The last time when you and I spoke afterwards, Keith and I had a Sunday discussion, and we had a podcast day, and he had spoken about escaping Descartes' prison. And we had a whole 3-hour podcast. And thereafter, Keith and I decided, let's have another lecture because he's now growing on his reactivity schema theory. I'm not sure, have you guys discussed that yet?
No.
Okay.
No, I'd love to.
I'll let you guys chat about that. But then we had another 3-hour lecture series. So we spent an entire Sunday, literally almost around 6 to 7 hours, just on a full podcast mode. It was exhausting, but one of the best Sundays you can have.
Keith, even though he says that he finds it exhausting.
He does.
Wow.
He pushed through. It was amazing. So the lectures were, I've got it both online. I'll send you links. It's really interesting the way he's sort of fine-tuning the illusionist argument with a reactivity schema theory. So maybe ask him about that when you chat to him.
Yeah, I will. But that says something about your thesis, that those people, I would guess they're all the same as me. Some younger. I mean, Michael is much younger and probably has a lot more energy, therefore. But, get sent so many things like this. And you think, for God's sake, you person I've never heard of, have written a thesis. Are you really expecting me? Don't you understand how much I've got to do? That's sort of, a very natural reaction. But then I will think, it's part of your job, not a job, but, your life, is at least have a look. And so often you can look and there's an abstract and it's absolutely clear that either it's beyond I don't have I'm not competent, or it's complete garbage and I can just write back and say, well, good luck with your thesis, but I'm sorry, and there will be a rare one where actually it's tempting enough to think, yeah, I can learn something from this and I can help this person and so on. So that's brilliant that they were able to help you. But Keith is exceptional in how much effort he puts into it.
No, I agree. He's wonderful. So you mentioned that you were on this retreat, exploring altered states of consciousness, because Peter and I just spoke the other day. And that's when he said he's actually going to call you to come visit. But we were discussing how from his data, it says that most people who have altered states of consciousness, maybe if they go on DMT, whether it's psilocybin, doesn't matter, they seem to go into a more panpsychist view. But I said, I would think that people would go more into an idealist framework. But it seems that the data heads towards a panpsychist view. Do you think exploring altered states of consciousness over time? I've had altered states of consciousness, just to make it clear that it's, I'm not judging it in any way, but do you think exploring altered states of consciousness would open someone's mind to a more panpsychist view?
I wish that were true. As far as I know from the evidence from psychedelics, people become more dualist after classical psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin. And I was really rather depressed to read that. This was some evidence that came out, 4 or 5 years ago. And I was quite depressed by that because I know people and I know myself being more likely to become monist rather than dualist. And so panpsychism is a kind of monism in a way. And so I can see that. And that's much more hopeful to me that people would come that way. I think the philosophical lines that we draw may not be the appropriate ones for talking about this. After all, the philosophical concepts that we have come from 2000 or more years, and they may not be the best way of dividing up how the mind works. So although I think it's really useful, and I'm really thrilled that this work on psychedelics is actually happening now. God, how awful that the war on drugs prevented it for so long. But anyway, at least it's happening now. That we need other ways of thinking about this. I mean, so many people with LSD, for example, will become animists, which is sort of heading, it's kind of panpsychism, I suppose, because you have this feeling when you look out. I mean, I'm looking at a sort of it's kind of a palm tree. This is a little bit of the edge of southwest England where palm trees can survive. And I'm looking at the waving and this stormy wind we've got. Now, if I were on acid tripping, I'm pretty sure I would feel the life force within that thing I'm looking at. It's alive, and and I would feel there is something it's like to be it, and I would feel that I'm part of it, and we're all one, and that's very common, and I'm used to that. I know what that feels like. Now, how does that fit within philosophy? I don't think it's terribly helpful to. Well, maybe it is, but I don't think it neatly fits into one philosophical view rather than another. I think we've got a lot of exploring to do.
Yeah, I think there's also certain linguistic limitations that we might have, and it becomes very difficult to explain these ineffable experiences.
Well, that's an aspect of what I'm saying, really, that we use words. If we're being philosophers, we're using philosophical words, but if we're not philosophers, then we're still using words in our language that make sense to us, and they've evolved over time. A lot of them not in the context of thinking about altered states. But Peter and I have talked about these kinds of things a lot. But the altered states I was talking about in this retreat last week are not like, and there's something in common, but they're not like psychedelic states. They're much more concentrated, much less, I wouldn't be looking at that palm tree and feeling in that way. In fact, I'd have my eyes shut and be deep, deep, deep in concentration and kind of going down and down into kind of the depths of simplifying the mind.
I've never been to a retreat. What do those experiences do for you in terms of your own clarity of thought, generating new ideas, and just experiencing and being in general?
Depends on the type of retreat. The first retreat I ever went on was in 1981. That was called a Western Zen retreat, led by John Crook, who was he's dead now, a Zen master, also trained in other traditions than Zen. It's actually Chan, the Chinese predecessor to Zen. And those retreats, and I went on many, many others in that same tradition, are based on open awareness meditation. It's all about training attention. In the end, all of this is training attention in different ways. So Zen, Zazen, just sitting, Shikantaza, it's all applying equal attention to everything without judgment. Is one way of putting it. May not be ideal, but anyway. So really training attention to do that is a lifetime's work. It's hard, but you get better at it. Now, how does that answer your question? That kind of meditation, it changes your relationship to the world, and in odd ways that must be explicable, I suppose, but it encourages compassion and openness and facing up to your fears. I mean, actually, I suppose it's very simple. Here's a very simple aspect. If you have to sit there hour after hour after hour, gazing at it, you have your eyes open for that kind of meditation, and you're looking typically at a white wall, but even the smoothest white wall will have, but often you're looking at a carpet or some piece of wood on the floor, and it's and then it's all the worries that you've got and all the miseries and all the anger. And for me, it's anger is usually the problem, but it can be regrets, and you have to face yourself, and doing that leads to big changes. Philosophically, it's much harder to say. And, if you're a Buddhist, you're going to get tied up in Buddhist philosophy and all sorts of stuff. But I'm not, and I didn't.
Mm.
Now, changing over to the kind of retreat that I'm talking about now, I mean, I still do Zen retreats or Chan retreats. I'm going to be doing one in June, which is using a koan, these weird kind of questions that you struggle with. So it's not just who am I staring at this wall, but some other thing you've got to do. But these jhanas ones are very different. So in the early suttas, the Buddha says, practice the jhanas. And they are a series of 8 increasingly deep states achieved through concentration. So open awareness is not really concentration, it's open attention, but this is like narrow the attention down. And you get into these different states. So what they tell us, I think, is very different. You could, well, I don't know how much you want to know about this, and I've forgotten what your question was, and I've just started rambling. So I'll shut up and see what you want to know.
So no, I was just curious to know if it does actually impact your philosophical framework in any way post the experience.
Yes, absolutely, it does. Okay, so cutting all the complications of, so I can't do all of these at all. I think I can do some. But the last task that we were given on the last day was to go out for a walk, and this comes from a particular story of what happened to somebody the Buddha met and so on, who had a wrong view of some kind, and the Buddha said to this guy. This man was asking, in his tradition, had been seeking the who is it who sees and who is it who hears and all of this, and the Buddha says to him, in seeing there is only seeing, in hearing there is only hearing, in touching is only touch, and it's so on. And these stories always ramble on incredibly repetitively and tediously. But anyway, so we were sent out, and by this time, after this is the 10th day of meditating, many, many hours a day, we were sent out to go for a walk. And one suggestion is walking out of time. So that's another thing that we discussed, but it's a slightly different part of it. But let it be, seeing is just seeing, and hearing is just hearing. Now, it happened to be a really stormy day. There were the trees thrashing around and a lot of building going on, these plastic things, and the plastic was kind of crashing, and the sound was. And then as I got down towards the beach, these big crashing waves, and the sights of all this, and practicing this. And what, of course, it's getting at is there isn't anybody seeing, there's just seeing. And in this way, you look at this, and then this, and they're not tied together as an order in time. There's seeing, and there's hearing, and there's this. And so it's demolishing, it's yet another way of demolishing the false view that I'm in here looking out through my eyes and seeing an external world. So that, yes, that, and I would say, I'm glad you asked, because that's a good example of why I keep going. Why I keep doing, because it's bloody hard work. I mean, a lot of that retreat, I was like, oh God, why did I ever sign up to this? And, I've got to do another hour and I can't bear it, But in the end, it's amazing. It's amazing to actually experience that. And that fits with philosophical changes in your life.
Yeah, no, so I agree. I think that it is strange that the research says people become more dualistic, because the association is often non-duality with these types of experience. So
yeah,
it's fascinating. I wonder what I'm going to look into that research to make sure. But before we go back into that, you mentioned that when Dennett had passed away, you were driving on your way to Tucson, and I spoke to Stuart Hameroff about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3. This year's one is in Barcelona, and this time he's focusing the conference solely on the quantum and classical reality and meeting in between. And this theme for this year seems to be directly linked to this view of consciousness, which seems to link more with idealist views, but he's also got a lot of neuroscientific theorists coming through. What are your thoughts on this approach for the conference this year?
Total crap.
I was expecting that.
I looked at the program for Barcelona and I thought, And there's a few really good people going, but oh, what are they doing? Stuart and I have had troubles together, and I know Stuart pretty well. And there's the time when I was supposed to be having a conversation on stage with Deepak Chopra, and Stuart actually interrupted while we were given a few minutes introduction to do, and he was the chairperson, right? And he interrupted my little introduction because I mentioned that I'd been inspired to do by having this out of body experience to investigate, and I said it's wonderful in my life that we now can understand how they happen. Come on then, give some proof then, he said. He's the chairman. So then Deepak gets at me, and the whole thing just descended. It's all online. It descended into ridiculousness. And then his wife, his fifth wife, I think he's now on the sixth, but anyway, his fifth wife, I didn't realize who it was at the time, but the crowd were sort of shouting, "Let her speak," and stuff after half an hour of this going on. And somebody came up, but I was told later that it was his wife, and said, "Stuart, let her speak." So subsequently, he apologized, and I accept his apology, and that's fine. Deepak and I just decided I'm not having any more of this crap with Deepak. I'm gonna because every time I've had dinner with Deepak on my own the night before that, and we get on so well, and we talk about all sorts of interesting stuff. And I thought we need to do that online, and I asked him if we could, and to his credit, he did. He agreed, and we then did a good podcast. And he wants to do another one. I was going to say later this month, but anyway, very soon. He wants to do another one, and we've proved now that we can have those nice conversations. So, sorry, going back to Stuart. Stuart is very forceful. He is utterly convinced by his own quantum theory, which is different from the original one that he started out with. He will get Roger Penrose online every possible opportunity. He started out with Penrose with one version of his quantum theory, the collapse of the wave function in microtubules, and has gone on to a different version. It still depends on microtubules, but he keeps saying there's kind of evidence that supports his theory, which is bits of evidence to do with the possibility of quantum computing or some kind of quantum effects relevant to cognition in the brain. And he's absolutely sure he's right, which is not a good stand for a scientist. You need this balance. You need to be really, I think I'm right. And, oh, isn't this exciting if I am right? And how am I going to prove myself wrong in case I am wrong? And, what would happen if I'm, and he's just absolutely convinced he's right. Now, here's the point. Let us suppose that there were quantum computing in microtubules. It's possible. It seems unlikely to me. And there's all the problem of the temperature and everything. But, let's suppose there were. Or let's suppose that in some other way, the brain is a quantum computer. How does that help solve the problem? Doesn't solve the hard problem. I mean, why should consciousness suddenly arise from quantum computing in a way that we think but haven't discovered that it arises from ordinary computing? There's nothing in his theory that addresses the problem of consciousness at all. As far as I'm concerned, that's why I feel it's legitimate, as I wouldn't very often, to just say a rude word. I mean, it's sad to me that it's so popular because it sounds great, doesn't it? Ooh, quantum stuff. And it must be very clever if you can. Of course, I can't understand quantum mechanics. I don't have the maths. And, people are thinking, wow, it must be very clever. And I don't think Stuart understands quantum mechanics either. He's not a mathematician. He's not a physicist. And yet it's hugely popular. And now the whole of the conference in Barcelona is going to be devoted to that. Well, I hope they have a lovely time despite that, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere helpful for us in understanding the nature of mind.
Yeah, I think the funny thing is that the ACC, what is the other conference called? The
ASSC, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness.
I think that's on the same week. So he was really pissed about that. Yes. Yeah. So that's in Crete.
That's it. That's in Crete, in Greece. Yeah.
So that's where Keith is actually. It would be a good opportunity to visit Keith as well. But the funny thing was today I was on Twitter And I don't think you have Twitter, right, Sue?
No.
Yeah. Well, luckily, because if you see the wars that go down with Stuart, I think it was Anil Seth and Stuart having a back and forth this morning, and it was pretty crazy. Yeah, it's not the most polite conversation to see.
Tell me about it, because I mean I'm not even going to see it probably.
Let me see if I can
give
find
me the gist. Yeah, do.
I'll find it right now, because Stuart's quite active on Twitter, and I even told him it's like watching a show. One thing, as I find this, one thing Stuart did say, which to his credit, is that Chalmers said that if Stuart perhaps is not around anymore, and then the theory comes out to be true, then people might be okay with it. Because Stuart said that Chalmers said they just don't like the idea of letting you have the fun of it being correct. So he did admit to that, and he does know he comes across this way. So in his defense. So I think here it is. So it says, wait 1 second, almost there. There we go. Anil Seth, David Chalmers, and Neil deGrasse Tyson make the same ignorant mistake, arguing for conscious AI, saying silicon is no different than carbon. Even if that were true, life, consciousness, and are based on organic carbon in aromatic ring structures within intrinsic quantum optical properties. These guys are experts, question mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. And he tags them. So that's the funny thing. He tags all three of them into this. And then they start having a conversation. Then Anil's like, Stuart, you are entitled to your own opinions, but not to consistently misrepresent mine. I make it very clear that I'm skeptical of silicon-based conscious AI, making the case different from your case, that consciousness is a biological property. And then it just keeps going. Back and forth. But yeah, these are the conversations you're missing out on.
I wonder whether Anil thinks that it's a good use of his time to do this. I mean, I'm just wondering. I've just resisted getting involved with X and all that. But
yeah,
well, I think I'm too old. I'm not going to. But it's very interesting to hear a snippet of what's going on there. Anil is great. I mean, I really like his work. I really loved his book.
Yes.
Obviously, we disagree quite a lot, and he doesn't think much of my new ideas that we were talking about. But we also have a lot in common, and I think his book has really been a good contribution to people understanding predictive processing.
Mm. Yeah, Sue, do you have any upcoming, in terms of books, papers, any work that you're working on that you'd like to share with the audience? So we seem to have gone off on a tangent.
We have, and also it's been an hour, and we need to stop, don't we? We can always have another go, which will be fun, because it's always fun talking to you. No, not really. I mean, I was so utterly exhausted by the book. My daughter Emily and I did the 4th edition of the consciousness textbook, and it was an exhausting job, not because of the work of actually doing the writing and the updating. That was worthwhile and fun and interesting. The bloody publishers made it, the copy editors were so bad. They actually changed things we'd written, added references in the wrong place why? I mean, they just, really messed things up. And guess it's putting that all right, because we're meticulous people who want everything right. And it was a nightmare. And honestly, I was like drained. But I've got lots of ideas for books, and then I don't actually decide what to start on. So my job now is to write this article about the ideas that we were talking about earlier, about models and why they're the subject of consciousness, not objects. And we'll see where that takes me. I mean, I keep fantasizing out a book about that, but I haven't actually started that. And then I'm thinking about a 2nd edition of the Me Machine, because people keep, interestingly, now this is weird. So Keith Frankish was saying how much he enjoyed rereading the Me Machine, because he'd read it a long time ago, and that he said how prescient it was in terms of what's happening with AI and LLMs and all the other things going on there. And that made me think, I talked to OUP who published it, about doing a 2nd edition, and then I never got on to actually submitting a proposal. But then on this retreat, the guy, Lee Brasington, leading the retreat, the jhanas expert, he said, somebody asked in the chat thing, oh, can you give a list of your books, that we'd like to read them? And I put that, and he said, where's the meme machine? Where's the meme machine? Because to him, at the end of the meme machine, where I talk about how the self is constructed, the false self, the illusion of self is constructed by them for the meme's benefit. It's not for us, which is why I say it's not a benign user illusion. It's actually a malign user illusion, because it's actually in the service of the memes. It's making the brain work very hard to take in certain memes that are all to do with me and selfishly and so on and so on. And I guess that kind of fitted with the sort of Buddhist idea. So that, it's like coming up with these, that makes me think I really ought to get on with doing the second edition. And I'm sure that's a better use of my time than going on Twitter.
I completely agree. And look, I've read that book twice, and it's been a while since I've read it. Yeah. So, and I actually look forward, now that Keith has given it such high praise, I think it's time to give it a go again. So thank you so much, Sue. It's always a pleasure chatting to you. And I'm looking forward to reading your new papers about this. It sounds really fascinating.
Okay, well, I will send it to you if I actually manage, or when I manage to do it. Well, great. It's been lovely again talking to you.
Thanks, Sue. Have a great one. And until next time, good luck with Deepak.
Thank you very much. Bye.